I'm standing in what used to be my childhood bedroom, watching my stepmother Carol shove my clothes into garbage bags like I'm some kind of pest she's finally getting rid of. Her perfectly manicured nails click against her phone screen as she types, probably texting her friends about how she's finally getting her house back. The smell of her overpowering vanilla perfume fills the room, the same scent that's haunted this house for the past 8 years. My hands are shaking as I watch her toss my dad's old baseball glove, the one he taught me to catch with, into the donation pile like it's worthless junk. She doesn't even look at me when she says, "Truck comes at 3. Make sure you're gone by then." The casual cruelty in her voice hits me like a slap, but I've learned to keep my face blank around her. She feeds off reactions, and I stopped giving her that satisfaction years ago. But inside, I'm screaming because this isn't just about moving out. This is about erasing every trace of the daughter my father loved. You see, my 18th birthday was supposed to be a celebration, maybe a small party with my few close friends, definitely not this nightmare of being literally thrown out of the only home I've ever known. But Carol had been counting down the days like a prisoner marking time until freedom, and the moment that calendar flipped to March 15th, she pounced. She had the eviction notice ready. Yes, an actual legal document treating me like a tenant instead of family, and she served it to me with my birthday pancakes. "Happy birthday, sweetie," she'd said with that fake smile she uses when people are watching. "Time to spread your wings and fly." But her eyes were cold as ice, and I knew this had nothing to do with independence and everything to do with the fact that she'd been waiting 8 long years to finally get rid of me. She'd married my dad when I was 10, and from day one, she saw me as competition for his attention, his love, and most importantly, his money. Let me take you back to how this all started, because understanding Carol requires understanding just how calculating she really is. My dad, Robert Mitchell, was a successful contractor who built custom homes for wealthy families across our county in North Carolina. He wasn't rich by millionaire standards, but he was comfortable, very comfortable, and he owned valuable property, including the family home where 4 generations of Mitchells had lived. When my mom died of cancer when I was 9, Dad was devastated, and I think his grief made him vulnerable to someone like Carol. She was working as a real estate agent, and she helped Dad sell Mom's car because he couldn't bear to look at it anymore. She was beautiful, charming, and she knew exactly how to position herself as the solution to a grieving widower's problems. She'd show up with casseroles, offer to help with my school events, and slowly but surely, she made herself indispensable. Within 6 months, she'd moved in, and within a year, they were married in a small ceremony that felt more like a business transaction than a celebration of love. From the very beginning, Carol's treatment of me was like a masterclass in psychological manipulation. In front of Dad, she was the perfect stepmother, always asking about my grades, offering to take me shopping, suggesting family activities that made her look like she was trying so hard to bond with me. But the moment Dad left for work, her mask would slip completely. She'd make comments about how I was taking advantage of Dad's kindness, how I needed to learn to be more independent, and how some kids my age were already working part-time jobs to help their families. She had this way of making everything I did seem selfish or ungrateful. If I left a dish in the sink, I was inconsiderate. If I stayed in my room doing homework, I was antisocial. If I tried to spend time with Dad, I was monopolizing him and being clingy. She'd deliver these criticisms with this concerned, motherly tone that made me question whether I was actually the problem. The gaslighting was so subtle and consistent that I started to believe maybe I really was a burden, maybe I really was the selfish one. The worst part was watching how she slowly changed Dad. Before Carol, he was hands-on, involved in every aspect of my life. He'd help with homework, come to every school play, and we'd spend Saturdays working on projects in his workshop. But Carol had this way of inserting herself into everything, always with reasonable-sounding explanations. "Robert, honey, don't you think she's old enough to handle her own homework? Maybe we should let her learn independence instead of always rescuing her. She needs to learn that the world won't revolve around her forever." Gradually, Dad started pulling back, not because he loved me less, but because Carol convinced him that loving me meant forcing me to be more self-sufficient. She'd schedule romantic dates during my school events, plan weekend trips when I had important games, and somehow always managed to create conflicts between Dad's time with me and their time together. If Dad chose me, she'd sulk and make comments about how she understood that I would always come first, making him feel guilty for being a good father. By the time I turned 16, the house felt like enemy territory. Carol had redecorated everything, replacing Mom's warm, cozy touches with her sterile, magazine-perfect aesthetic. Photos of Mom were quietly moved to my bedroom, replaced with professional portraits of Dad and Carol. She'd throw dinner parties and introduce me as Robert's daughter, with just enough emphasis to make it clear I wasn't really part of their perfect couple image. She'd make passive-aggressive comments about how I ate them out of house and home, or how expensive it was to maintain a teenager. When I got my first job at 17, she actually had the audacity to suggest I should contribute to household expenses to learn responsibility, while she spent hundreds of dollars a week on spa treatments and designer clothes. The psychological warfare was relentless and exhausting, but I endured it because I believed that once I turned 18, once I graduated high school, things would somehow get better. I thought maybe Dad would finally see through her manipulation, or maybe I'd have enough freedom to rebuild my relationship with him. I never imagined that my 18th birthday would be the day she'd finally make her ultimate move to erase me from our family completely. The signs that Carol was planning something had been there for months, but I was too focused on graduating and planning for college to connect the dots. She'd started making comments about how expensive it was going to be to help me with college, despite the fact that I'd earned a partial scholarship and had been working part-time since junior year to save money. She'd sigh dramatically whenever college brochures arrived in the mail, muttering things like some families just can't afford to support their kids forever loud enough for Dad to hear. When I'd try to discuss my plans with Dad, she'd interrupt with concerns about realistic expectations and how maybe I should consider community college first to ease the financial burden. The way she positioned herself as the voice of reason while painting me as financially irresponsible was masterful. She never directly said I couldn't go to college, but she planted seeds of doubt that made Dad start questioning whether we could really afford to support my education when they had their own future to think about. The manipulation reached new heights during my senior year when she started what I now recognize as a campaign to isolate me from Dad completely. She'd schedule romantic getaways during my important senior events, always with perfectly reasonable explanations. "Oh, honey, this was the only weekend the bed and breakfast had available, and we've been so stressed lately," she'd say, making Dad feel guilty for even considering staying home for my senior night or graduation rehearsal. She started booking Dad's evenings with social events I wasn't invited to, couples dinners and wine tastings, and charity galas where bringing a teenager would be inappropriate. When I'd complain about feeling left out, she'd turn it around on me, saying things like, "Not everything revolves around you, sweetie, and your father deserves to have an adult social life." She had this way of making my completely normal desire to spend time with my only parent seem selfish and immature. The financial manipulation was perhaps the most insidious part of her strategy. Carol had convinced Dad to combine their finances completely after they married, which meant she had insight into every penny coming in and going out. She'd make comments about my expenses, things like school supplies, gas money, even groceries, as if I was some kind of financial drain on their household. "Do you know how much it costs to feed a teenage athlete?" she'd ask Dad, conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd been contributing money from my job toward household expenses for over a year. She started itemizing costs, keeping a literal spreadsheet of what I cost them monthly, which she'd casually mention during their financial planning conversations. She'd talk about their retirement goals, their dream vacation plans, the renovations they wanted to make to their house, always with the underlying message that supporting me was holding them back from the life they deserved together. The psychological abuse escalated as my 18th birthday approached. Carol started making increasingly bold statements about independence and expectations. When I turned 18, my parents made it clear that it was time to stand on my own 2 feet. She'd announce at dinner, as if this were some universal truth rather than her personal experience. She'd share stories about friends whose children had moved out immediately after high school, always praising these parents for raising independent kids and subtly criticizing parents who enabled their children by providing continued support. She started leaving apartment listings on the kitchen counter, circled in red ink, with notes like "thought you might want to start looking" written in her neat handwriting. When I'd show these to Dad, she'd act like she was being helpful, saying she was just trying to give me options and help me prepare for the real world. The breaking point came 2 weeks before my birthday when I overheard a phone conversation that revealed the true depth of her manipulation. She was talking to her sister Linda, and she didn't realize I was home early from work. "I've been laying the groundwork for months," she was saying, her voice filled with excitement rather than the fake concern she usually displayed. "Robert's finally starting to see that she needs to learn independence. I've got him convinced that kicking her out is actually the loving thing to do." She laughed, as she described her strategy. "The key is making him think it's his idea, you know? I never directly say she has to go. I just keep talking about how proud we'll be when she's standing on her own 2 feet. The casual cruelty in her voice made my stomach turn, but it was what she said next that truly horrified me. "Once she's gone, we can finally start living like a real married couple. No more walking on eggshells around the precious princess. This house will finally be ours." That conversation shattered any remaining illusions I had about Carol's motivations. This wasn't about preparing me for independence or helping me grow up. This was about eliminating what she saw as competition for Dad's attention and resources. She'd spent 8 years playing the long game, slowly poisoning my relationship with my father and positioning herself as the reasonable adult while painting me as the burden they needed to shed. The most devastating part was realizing how successful she'd been. Dad, who used to be my biggest champion, had gradually bought into her narrative that tough love meant pushing me out of the nest. When I tried to talk to him about my fears of being forced out, he'd parrot her talking points about independence and self-reliance, using the exact phrases she'd been drilling into his head for months. She'd turned my own father into her weapon against me, and the worst part was that he genuinely believed he was doing what was best for me. The woman who was supposed to be my stepmother had become my greatest enemy, and she'd convinced the one person who should have protected me that abandoning me was actually an act of love. The morning of my 18th birthday, I woke up with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with dread. I could hear Carol moving around downstairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors with unusual energy, like she was preparing for Christmas morning. When I came down for breakfast, there she was with that perfectly fake smile, standing behind a plate of pancakes arranged in the shape of the number 18. "Happy birthday, sweetie," she chirped, but her eyes held a glint of triumph that made my skin crawl. Dad was sitting at the table reading his phone, completely oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. He looked up and smiled genuinely when he saw me, and for a moment, I thought maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe this day wouldn't be the disaster I'd been dreading. But then Carol set down the legal envelope next to my orange juice, and my heart stopped. "We have something very special for you," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. It's time for you to spread your wings and become the independent young woman we know you can be. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, already knowing what I'd find, but hoping desperately that I was wrong. The eviction notice was professionally printed, complete with legal terminology and a 30-day deadline. 30 days to find housing, pack my entire life, and disappear from the only home I'd ever known. Dad was watching my face, and I could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes, like maybe he was finally realizing this wasn't the loving gesture Carol had convinced him it was. "Honey," he started, his voice hesitant, but Carol immediately jumped in with her prepared speech about how this was the greatest gift they could give me, how proud they were of raising such a capable young woman, and how excited they were to see me flourish on my own. She had an answer for every concern, every objection, every moment of doubt that crossed Dad's face. When I looked at him pleadingly, hoping he'd realize how cruel this was, she squeezed his shoulder and reminded him of their conversation about tough love and how his own parents had pushed him to be independent at my age. The next few days were a blur of panic and desperate planning. I reached out to my few close friends, but they were all in similar situations, living with parents, preparing for college, not exactly in positions to take in a homeless teenager. I looked at apartments, but even with my part-time job, the math was impossible. First month's rent, last month's rent, security deposit, utilities. The costs added up to more than I'd saved in 2 years of working. Carol watched my growing panic with barely concealed satisfaction, occasionally offering helpful suggestions like checking out the YWCA or looking into subsidized housing programs. She'd make these suggestions in front of Dad, positioning herself as supportive while simultaneously highlighting just how dire my situation was. The message was clear. This was what independence looked like, and if I couldn't handle it, that was my problem, not theirs. But something changed in me during those desperate days of apartment hunting and financial calculations. Maybe it was the exhaustion of trying to hold on to relationships that had already been poisoned, or maybe it was finally accepting that the father I'd known and loved had been replaced by Carol's version of him. I stopped begging, stopped explaining, stopped trying to make them see reason. Instead, I started making calls that Carol couldn't monitor because she didn't know they were happening. I called my dad's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, who had handled Mom's estate and Dad's business contracts for years. I called my high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had always taken an interest in my situation. And most importantly, I called my grandmother on Mom's side, Nana Beth, who lived 3 states away, but had been trying to maintain a relationship with me despite Carol's subtle efforts to minimize contact with Mom's family. The first breakthrough came from Mr. Patterson's office. When I explained my situation, his assistant mentioned that there had been some documents my father had filed years ago that I might want to review. "Your father updated his will and estate planning when he remarried," she explained, but there were some provisions that were specifically protected and couldn't be changed. She couldn't give me details over the phone, but she could schedule an appointment for me to review documents that concerned me directly. The appointment was set for the day before my eviction deadline, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of something that might have been hope. Carol had been so focused on controlling the narrative around my departure that she'd never considered I might have resources or rights she didn't know about. The real turning point came when Nana Beth called me back after I'd left her a tearful voicemail explaining everything that was happening. Her voice was shaking with anger when she spoke, but it wasn't anger directed at me. "Sweetheart," she said, "your mother made me promise to watch out for you if anything ever happened to her and your father. I've been waiting for you to be old enough to understand some things, and I think that time has come." She told me she'd been saving money for years in an account designated for my education and future, money from Mom's life insurance that Dad didn't even know existed because Mom had set it up through her own family. But more importantly, She told me about conversations she'd had with Dad shortly after he'd married Carol, conversations about protecting my inheritance and ensuring that I'd always have a place in the family home. "Your father may have forgotten some promises he made," she said quietly, "but the law doesn't forget, and neither do I." That night, as I lay in bed listening to Carol and Dad arguing downstairs about whether they were being too harsh, an argument she was clearly winning, I realized that my entire approach had been wrong. I'd been fighting to hold on to relationships that were already lost, begging for love and acceptance from people who had decided I was expendable. But I wasn't powerless, and I wasn't alone. I had rights, resources, and people who actually cared about my well-being. The scared, desperate girl who had been frantically searching for apartments was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to fight for what was rightfully mine. Carol thought she'd won by isolating me from Dad and positioning me as a burden to be discarded. What she didn't realize was that she'd pushed me to discover strength and support systems she never knew existed. Tomorrow, I would walk into Mr. Patterson's office and learn exactly what cards I'd been holding all along. And then, it would be my turn to surprise Carol with some information she definitely wasn't expecting. Mr. Patterson's office smelled like leather and old books, the kind of place where important family business had been conducted for generations. As I sat across from his mahogany desk, he spread out documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my situation. "Your father came to me about 6 months after he married Carol," he began, adjusting his reading glasses. "He was concerned about protecting your interests, especially regarding the family property and your mother's wishes." My heart was pounding as he explained that Dad had created an irrevocable trust when I was 11, placing the family home and a significant portion of his assets in my name, with provisions that couldn't be altered even if he remarried. The house where Carol had been playing queen for 8 years? I was actually the legal owner and had been since I was a child. Dad was essentially a lifetime tenant, and Carol had no legal claim to the property whatsoever. But that wasn't even the most shocking revelation. Mr. Patterson pulled out another set of documents that made my hands shake as I read them. When Mom died, her life insurance and investment accounts had been placed in a trust managed by Nana Beth, with the funds designated specifically for my education and future needs. The account had been growing for nearly 9 years and now contained enough money to pay for college, graduate school, and provide a substantial safety net for my future. "Your mother was very specific," Mr. Patterson explained. "She wanted to ensure that no matter what happened, you would never be dependent on anyone else's goodwill for your basic needs or education." Carol's financial manipulation suddenly seemed pathetic in comparison to the security my real mother had provided for me from beyond the grave. The final piece of the puzzle was a letter Dad had written and sealed when he'd set up the trust, to be given to me on my 18th birthday or in case of emergency. Mr. Patterson handed me the envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting, dated 8 years ago when he'd still been the father I remembered. Inside, Dad had written about his fears of remarrying, his concerns about protecting me, and his absolute commitment to honoring Mom's wishes. "If you're reading this," the letter said, "it means either you've turned 18 or something has gone wrong with my judgment. I'm setting up these protections because I love you more than life itself, and I need to know that you'll be safe no matter what choices I make or how those choices might affect my thinking." He had known, even then, that remarriage might compromise his ability to protect me, so he'd created legal safeguards that even his future self couldn't undo. Armed with this information, I drove home with a sense of power I'd never felt before. Carol was in the kitchen when I walked in, boxing up dishes and humming to herself like she was preparing for a celebration. "Oh, good, you're back," she said without looking up. "The truck will be here in 2 hours. I hope you found somewhere to stay because checkout time is firm." Her casual cruelty, which had terrorized me for years, suddenly seemed comical. I set my copy of the trust documents on the counter and watched her face change as she registered what she was looking at. "Actually, Carol," I said, my voice steady and strong, "I think there's been some confusion about who needs to leave." The color drained from her face as she scanned the legal documents, her perfectly manicured finger trembling as she traced the lines that established my ownership of the house. "This can't be right," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Robert would have told me. We're married. This is our home." I pulled out my phone and called Dad at work, putting the call on speaker. "Dad," I said when he answered, "Carol seems confused about something. Could you please explain to her why you set up the trust when I was 11? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like hours before Dad's voice came through, heavy with shame and realization. "Oh God," he whispered. "Carol, we need to talk. I'll be right home." When Dad arrived 30 minutes later, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. Carol immediately launched into her defensive strategy, claiming she'd never known about the trust, insisting that they were legally married and demanding to know how I could do this to them. But Dad wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me with eyes full of regret and recognition, seeing clearly for the first time in years what he'd allowed to happen to his daughter. "I set up that trust to protect you," he said quietly, "because I was afraid of exactly what ended up happening. I let her convince me that being tough with you was the right thing to do, but evicting you from your own home." He shook his head, finally seeing Carol's manipulation for what it was. "That's not tough love. That's cruelty." The next few hours were a blur of confrontations, revelations, and Carol's desperate attempts to maintain control. She tried guilt, claiming she'd given up her own life to be a mother to me. She tried manipulation, insisting that all her actions had been motivated by love and concern for my future. She even tried threats, suggesting that she'd make Dad choose between us. But the power dynamic had shifted completely. I wasn't the helpless teenager begging for acceptance anymore. I was the legal owner of the home, the recipient of substantial financial support, and most importantly, I was my father's daughter who had finally found her voice. When Carol realized that her 8-year campaign to erase me had not only failed, but had actually revealed her true nature to everyone, including Dad, she made one final play. "Fine," she said, her mask finally slipping completely to reveal the cold, calculating woman underneath. "If that's how you want to play this, then I want half of everything in the divorce. Community property laws, Robert. I'm entitled to half of what we've built together." But Mr. Patterson had anticipated this too. The trust had been structured to protect not just me, but Dad as well. The assets Carol thought she could claim in a divorce were largely held in trust, protected from her reach. Her face went from angry to terrified as she realized she'd overplayed her hand completely. She'd spent 8 years manipulating and controlling, convinced she was the smartest person in the room, but she'd been outmaneuvered by a woman who'd died when I was 9 and a father who'd loved me enough to protect me even from his own potential poor judgment. 6 months later, Carol was gone, living in a 1-bedroom apartment across town and working as a real estate agent again. Her dreams of financial security through marriage evaporated. Dad and I were rebuilding our relationship, attending family therapy to work through the damage that years of manipulation had caused. It wasn't easy. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight, and I had to learn to forgive him for choosing her lies over his own daughter's well-being. But we were both committed to healing, and for the first time in years, our home felt like a home again. I started college that fall, knowing that my education was secure and my future was my own to determine. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the people who try to make you feel powerless are actually terrified of the power you already possess. Carol spent 8 years trying to erase me from my own family, never realizing that my mother's love had created protections she couldn't see or touch. In the end, the woman who thought she was so clever was defeated by the love of a mother who'd been gone for nearly a decade, and by a father who'd been wise enough to protect his daughter, even when he couldn't protect himself from manipulation. The greatest gift wasn't the house, or the money, or even the security. It was learning that I was never as powerless as they wanted me to believe. And that real love creates protections that outlast death and survive even the most calculated attempts at destruction.